60 years later, the National Assembly here in Paris has today adopted a bill which recognises the damage suffered by the Harkis and their families. The Harkis were Algerians who supported and in some cases served in the French army during the Algerian War of Independence. Well, the bill, which must now be approved by the Senate, paves the way for the Harkis to be compensated, which campaigners say is a historic step. Well, for more, we can speak now to Paul Smith, Associate Professor and Head of French and Francophone Studies at the University of Nottingham. Thank you very much indeed for joining us once again here on France 24, Professor Smith. Just for the benefit of our audience, you're also a modern French historian, and you have a French politics blog called The Fifth and a Half Republic. Thank you for joining us. First of all, what's the significance of today's decision by the National Assembly, do you think?
Well, it's part of the process that actually began with Emmanuel Macron when he was candidate for the presidential election, when he talked about the relationship between France and Algeria. Last September, he began this process of asking for forgiveness, I think, or asking for a pardon from the Harkis for the fate that many of them suffered at the time of the Algerian War, and then later when those families that were able to escape to France suffered when they arrived in France. So it's part of the process of part of the bigger picture, actually, of trying to not draw a line, but come to terms with the continuing impact of the Algerian War of Independence, even 60 years after its end, as a war.
And why has it taken it quite so long? I mean, 60 years is a very long time. And I'm just wondering, a lot of people will sadly no longer be alive who would have been entitled for compensation.
Well, they might not be alive, but their families are, their children and their grandchildren, and they will get some kind of compensation. I mean, this is, it doesn't look like very much in individual cases. It looks like a big package from the budget end, but there will be people who will benefit from it. Something like 50,000 beneficiaries is one figure that I've seen. Part of the problem is, as I mentioned earlier, that there's never really been a process in France of coping with the Algerian question. It took the French a very long time to start to come to terms with Vichy and the collaboration, and it's taken a long time as well to come to terms with and to explore and to discuss and talk about Algeria, partly because, of course, the Algerian state doesn't want to really talk about those things, but particularly in France, this still underpins, and it of course raises all kinds of questions about France's colonial past as well. So it connects into a lot of different areas that only very slowly the French are beginning to talk about really openly.
And tell us a bit more about the role of the Harkis and why it was that they suffered so much when the lucky ones made it to France.
Well, what the Harkis basically were Muslims in Algeria, various different communities, but they signed up to support the French army, and there were hundreds, tens if not hundreds of thousands of them who volunteered, particularly from 1959 onwards, to fight on behalf of the French army. Now, their fate, of course, when independence came along, the new Algerian state promised that there wouldn't be reprisals, but there were. And there's some really heartrending footage of Harkis and their families trying to jump onto. It's a bit like the scene from The Killing Fields, where you have people trying to get onto helicopters and onto transport ships to escape from their fate. And then when they arrive in France, those who manage to get away, well, they were either put into holding camps, where those holding camps became, in fact, pretty much permanent residences for 10, 15 years for some, and some families were put into old former prisons and grew up there. And there are, as I say, the sons and daughters of those families that managed to get away, who have understandably become very vocal and have written about. I'm thinking of people like Dalila Kershoush, who've written about their experience growing up in these what were essentially internment camps. And that's something that part of this pardon is about. It's about saying not just sorry for having abandoned some of the Harkis in Algeria, but also the way that they were treated when they arrived in France and were essentially marginalized.